Hey guys, welcome back to Results Junkies podcast. Boy, did we go deep last time. I mean, like really deep. And here we are.
I'm not taking the bait.
59 minutes later. And we've got some new topics on the block. It's been a somewhat controversial week. I don't think I saw the non-compete non-compete decision come up, so we're going to talk about that. That one sort of came out of left field for me. We're going to talk a bit about tax credits and how they might be affecting certain types of startups. And if we have some time after that, Paul also surfaced a comment about Stripe and them accepting crypto coming up and how that might change the credit card ecosystem. And I'm 99% sure he and I are on other sides of that, either opposite sides of that issue. So
that is probably the only guarantee
that could be a fun one
today.
But if we end up with that as our third topic, we may go 59 minutes again, and Jeremiah may actually kill us. So we'll have to see if we can avoid that. Paul, how the heck are you?
I'm good, man. My wife has given me a hard time. She thinks I might be having a midlife crisis. I decided over the weekend to drag my 10-year-old gas grill to the curb, and I bought myself a fancy new charcoal grill smoker. Spent way too much money on this thing. My brother-in-law says, at my age, I'm supposed to either take a deep interest in learning, World War II history, or I need to learn how to start smoking meats. So I chose that.
Well, I mean, considering the last time that she said that you pivoted, you bought an Airstream, I was a little worried when you started down this road. And I'll just say that I think charcoal grill is a win for Dana if it's, compared to the Airstream. So
I told her it could be worse. And she was there were a lot of inappropriate comments too. She was like, whose meat are you playing with? And I was like, only mine and any that you bring home from the store for me.
All right then. Well then.
Do with that what you will, Jeremiah.
Make it spicy right from the get-go. Let's dig into non-competes. Quick bit of housekeeping first. He is Paul at resultsjunkies.com. I am Ed at pizzainmotion.com. And he is at Paul Seng on all those social media places. I am at Pizza in Motion. All right, so high level, non-compete agreements were something that were really popular when I was younger, and they've fallen a little bit out of favor. And a big part of that is that they've been significantly diluted over the years in California. And just because there's so many startups that either start in California or end up going through California at one point or another, from a technology standpoint, it became something of an industry norm that there would be, some limited amount of non-competes. But in a lot of other businesses, they still exist, and they exist for what some people could justify as good reasons. And in a recent decision, a court decision, has outlawed non-competes nationwide. And as far as I can tell, this is a fairly immediate effect, though it does appear there's some language in the decision that allows for the protection of existing non-compete agreements. But even that seems to be grandfathered to some degree. So stopping it there for just a second, you actually flagged this. I'm curious what your opinions are on this.
Well, I think so. I think to the outright sort of broad ban or cancellation of them, I think that was maybe a little bit heavy-handed, but I think directionally it's the right way to go. And what I mean by that is that I think that, and again, I'm speaking just in broad terms here, I think that when non-competes became the norm, I think they started with good intentions. Hey, you're working on this thing, and I don't want you to learn what you can learn here and then be my competitor, right across the street tomorrow. So conceptually, I think they started from a good place. I think what ended up happening over time, though, is that it got so broad that it started to potentially hurt people's livelihoods. And I think that's where, something had to be done. Now, I'll kind of reiterate, I don't know that the whole outright ban or cancellation of them is the right way to go. But I also respect that when you're in government, there's really no good answer here. But like, there were some examples that I was reading about. So there was some interesting conversation about this back and forth on Reddit or subreddits, about the topic. And you could see cases being made on both sides of that equation. Like, hey, I was working at a company and we got sold to a competitor. And as part of that deal, they put blanket NDAs out, or I'm sorry, non-competes out there. I didn't think anything of it. but now I've realized that I'm forced to work at a company that I don't agree with or whatever. And it's like in this particular case that really stood out to me was like based on religious grounds, where the buying company or the acquiring company was, heavily influenced by the religion of the founders and the owners, and that just didn't sit well, and now all of a sudden you've got a person that's subject to that. So anyway, I think it was a little heavy-handed the way it came out, but I think it's probably a good step in the right direction because the thing about it is that as long as you've got non-disclosures and other patent sort of protection or IP protection paperwork in place, you should be able to achieve the same thing if the original goal of the non-compete was to protect the IP. So I don't know. I'm curious how you feel about it too, because I know that when we were texting about this, I think we both came at it with very different views. So I don't want to steal your thunder here.
Yeah, now I want to go back and see what I said.
You know how this goes with the media cycle in general, right? Somebody hasn't read the actual announcement, and all they see is that all non-competes are being canceled. That's actually not true. There are
It seems like most are, though, because it seems like this is just limited to senior executives, existing senior executive agreements. So a couple
correct.
of things. So I'm going to read a quote. This was in the New York Times from the chair of the commission, Lena Khan. And then I want to talk a little bit about compensation as it relates to non-competes. She said the FTC's final rule to ban non-competes will ensure Americans have the freedom to pursue a new job, start a new business, or bring a new idea to market. And, that's true, but it doesn't discuss the damage this does to the existing company that hired them. And so I think the concern there, and like I'm a business owner, so I do have a bias there in terms of perspective. But let's think about this from a compensation standpoint. So for highly compensated individuals who are also usually either C-level employees or folks who spend a lot of time developing new products for companies, those are the jobs that are usually specifically geared towards non-compete agreements. And in those cases, a fair number of times, not all, but probably a majority, there's some level of compensation in exchange for that non-compete. They're receiving extra salary, they're receiving options, potentially restricted stock units, because they have a vested interest in the growth of the company. And now, to be clear, like there's still non-disclosure agreements and there's still trade secrets, but that can be tough to litigate. And I think the issue I have here is, so they say that there's, there's this ability for people to go out and create new concepts and stuff like that. This gets very murky. And I think you and I talked about this on the show a while ago. Remember, when I just Googled to make sure I had the company. Remember we were talking about our Apple Watches and Apple got sued by Masimo for the blood oxygen tech that they had come up with. Well, there was some question there about where did employees go? What were the ideas? What were the trade secrets? Things of that nature. These things take a long time to litigate, a long time.
Hmm.
And so now what you have is the rule in itself, to your point, might be good for the future, but for a company that's invested in a product that's backed by a lot of research and development, things of that nature, and has non-compete agreements for some of its key people, because those key people are fundamental to them being able to get a product to market, for them to have already paid the compensation in exchange for a non-compete and now be in a position where they may not be able to enforce that, that could put them at a pretty big financial disadvantage in terms of structurally important things to the company.
I agree with you. I mean, look, if you as an employer hired somebody, paid for them, took the risk on that person, and they have developed something or some process or something that is unique to you, it's not right for them to be able to then turn around and use it against you
Mhm.
the very next day. I agree with that conceptually. I think where this gets tricky, because the part I really, really agree with you on is that it gets really murky here somewhere, is it gets really tricky when the expansion of non-competes has rolled out so widely
Mhm.
that people that are not even in those roles have been wrapped up into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so like I could imagine that an executive for your business, you probably already negotiated a non-compete, and you know while they might while they might not actually, steal your IP or cause you any harm that way, if they went to a competing chain of restaurants, they might take the marketing relationships or the capital relationships you guys might have. I could totally see that. And you've
Sure.
probably baked that into your contracts. On the other hand, you know, pick somebody that is, low to mid level in one of your locations in Utah. There's probably nothing that that person does that requires a non-compete. In other words, now I'm not saying you did this. I'm just going to use this as an example. I
You can
think
make
what
me
has
out to be the
happened
bad guy.
though,
It's okay.
I think what's happened enough to catch the eye of the government is that even that example low to mid-level person was getting wrapped up in these non-competes. You and I probably know that those are unenforceable. You and I know that like it's probably not worth fighting over this for most of it. But to that person, that lay person who might be early in their career, the fact that that was a condition of employment now may make them mentally feel that they're stuck. They can't go anywhere. And now
Yeah.
their earnings are so I'm not saying that you've done that. I'm not saying right, but I'm just the use of non-competes seems to have gotten so broad that it wrapped up, an extra 80 or 90% of the workforce that really was not a threat. And it sort of like prohibited them from moving up the financial ladder.
Oh yeah, I could definitely see that position. I don't think that position's an unreasonable one. I think a more measured move would have been to say that senior executives could continue to sign and participate in non-competes, especially when you talk about publicly held companies. And although to some degree it does bleed over into the world that you and I live in, these are highly compensated individuals who have intense insight into the future plans of the company, years and years worth. And so to say that you can have that person leave and cover what's in their head with non-disclosure agreements is, I think, overly optimistic. Use the airlines as an example. I mean, all the C-level folks there have seen the fleet plans and the expansion plans and the marketing plans. If I can't take my files with me, but I can recall all that stuff from my mind, am I violating a non-disclosure agreement? Technically,
I
I'm not.
I think you are actually.
No, because you can't prove it. You can't prove I don't have any materials for you to prove it with. That's what I'm saying. Like, so if a trade secret, I mean, like people steal laptops and do stuff like that. I mean, that's easy. But I mean, you're talking. There's so many things that are conceptual. But if it's formulaic and it's biological and stuff like that, and I took the key formulas for developing, the next, super element. I mean, that stuff is definitely more tied to paperwork and a paper trail. But I think a lot of what's in key executives' heads is strategic in nature. And I think what probably would have been a more reasoned approach to this would have been some level of, for these highly compensated individuals, that there's some level of a return of that compensation if they would like to leave while they have a non-compete in place. They're not bound by the non-compete, but then they should, and this is a harder one, sort of like what we got into last week. It's a harder one to figure out what the right number is. But I think there's some middle ground that says, okay, look, like you're a C-level employee. We gave you X number of restricted stock units for performing this very high level function within the company. You're going to go perform that for someone else now. We need to be able to, so there's two things here. There's not just the non-compete aspect of it, but we need to be able to compensate the next individual that's going to be in your job, the one that does see the vision and wants to be here for 10 years. And if you just take that piece of the company with you and go build for someone else, then we didn't get the value. We didn't get the long-term planning that we paid for.
It'll be interesting to see how this sort of shakes out. When you think about like employee compensation and stuff like that, there is a term that I'm forgetting, but there's a certain wall between a protected class and an unprotected class, in terms of worker types, not hourly and salary. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like when you're writing an employment contract, you might say this is a,
Exempt and
um,
non-exempt?
yeah, that's it. Yeah. Exempt and non-exempt. Like, so I'm just surprised that they didn't maybe come up with something like that, because that's
Yeah.
kind of what you're defining here is
Mhm.
that, hey, listen, there is a set of work types and compensation levels that may be non-exempt and
Right.
need to comply with this ban. And then then there should be a way to then create some non-exempt roles So I'm just surprised they didn't define it that way, because right now it's kind of like the Wild West. And I think what's
Yeah.
going to happen is that for the next 12 to 24 months, unless something happens to amend this, I think there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on anybody moving from employer A to employer B in the United States.
Well, and I think you know that, and I'm not saying this is the reason why somebody should have a non-compete, but when we talk about the enforceability of a non-compete is a lot easier outside of California than to enforce non-disclosure and trade secret agreements, because trade secret and non-disclosure agreements require things like discovery. You need lawyers to go through documents and subpoena phones and company laptops, and like you need to prove that somebody took the material. If you change your LinkedIn profile and you were working for United Airlines today and American Airlines tomorrow in the same role, it's very clear you violated the non-compete agreement. And I think in some situations, that was part of the genesis for why non-compete agreements became more popular, because it was easier to discern that from a non-compete and easier to litigate on that. Not that it was easier to hold people per se, but you could just tell which side of the line somebody was on. I mean, if somebody, like using Strata as an example, if somebody is actively out there selling for your company and they're building a bunch of leads and they go work for one of your competitors, at what point, if they have a non-compete agreement, did they violate that if they now go after those customers?
So, okay, so the simple answer is, yeah, they violated it. But to your point, I think it comes back to how would we enforce it? That's the big question here.
Right.
Because
What's your damages? Yeah, all these sorts of questions. And once you get rid of non-compete, it's very hard to determine what that is.
Well, but here's the thing, and I'm just a sample size of one here, but in the few scenarios where we've helped a portfolio company just investigate the possibility of a non-compete being breached, more often than not, we had to advise them to walk away because the counter argument was going to be right to work. So in other words,
Right.
see, that's the underlying issue here, I think, for a lot of people, is that when investigations have been, started around whether a non-compete was breached, the company that felt offended says, "Hey, you signed this non-compete," and then they try to initiate discovery.
Yeah.
And then more often than not, the defense of the person that's being accused comes back immediately with, "Listen, this was this is a right to work issue, not a trade secret issue." And that's where the costs skyrocket.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying you're wrong, by the way. I just think that, I want to say we talked about a similar messy topic on the show like a year ago. And I think one of the things that I recall from that is that, when you're dealing with government and legality or legal stuff like this, as much as we want to search for the best way to solve this, often what you have to settle for is what's the least worst. I think that no reasonable person would disagree with the example you just gave. An executive that works at airline A immediately goes to airline B. Like that example, I don't think any reasonable person would disagree with you on that.
Right.
I think the issue, though, is that using that same example, as it stands today, the baggage handler at, airline A theoretically would not be able to go handle baggage at airline B. And do those contracts actually need to be there? Should that person have, even been forced to sign a non-compete as part of their employment contract? I mean, maybe that's a bad example, but it's the example that I would just use as the counterpoint. Because again, I don't think any reasonable person would disagree with you that the stuff inside people's head is hard. But yeah, anyway, I just think this rollout was just kind of weird. The way to just blanket ban it all, it seems kind of weird.
Yeah, I think you and I both agree on this in a roundabout sort of way, in that I think we both think that the non-competes probably went too far, and that there's probably still some level of position that they should be covered by, and maybe it should be more narrowly defined. I think based on the fact that we're almost 20 minutes in now, I don't think we're going to get to both the Stripe topic and the tax credit topic, and they're both really, really interesting topics. So, let's try.
Well, I was gonna say, now that we just started talking about R&D. Why don't we actually just move to that topic, that tax topic?
No, I know that's what I say, but I think at this point we're going to park Stripe, but I definitely want to get the Stripe discussion in. So hopefully people will hold us accountable if we don't record on it next week. So on this R&D thing, so this was a byproduct of tax legislation that was passed a number of years ago during the Trump administration. It's not a political comment, more just talking about how the based on some ways that things have phased out of the bill. What's happening now is that if you have a startup, if you will, that's in one of these emerging technology areas. I'm not talking about, like I think the example I used for Paul on the pre-show was like building Superhuman, the next email app. But like if you're pharma tech, ag tech, chemical engineering, things like that have long tail, lots of research, potentially lots of coding, you could deduct all of your research and development costs on an ongoing basis. And in some cases, your company would not have a lot of income because you'd be in the nascent stages of growing the company, and you'd have lots of expenses. And so at least in those situations, you weren't incurring these massive tax bills while you're still investing heavily in the growth of the company. Well, what the IRS has said now, well, that they've said, but how the legislation is being enforced now is, if you have $1 million in R&D expenses this year, then instead of being able to deduct that entire $1 million this year, you have to spread it out over 5 years. And so by doing so, you now have $200,000 in this year and $200,000 a year for the next 4 years after that. But that also means you have $800,000 more in profit that you have to realize, and you have to plan for that from a tax standpoint.
Right.
And where I think this gets especially painful is not in year one, but in the out years, as you know, as these companies start to ramp up, you're stacking on more research and development costs in future years, but you're only amortizing over 5 years. So as the amount increases, you're actually backloading more and more of this depreciation for further down the road,
Right.
and creating larger and larger tax liabilities. And I would say two things. First off, I think the majority is probably the wrong word, a large number of the startup founders that I have worked with over the years are not well versed in tax strategy and in planning for things like this, holding aside hundreds of thousands of dollars in free cash to be able to pay future tax liabilities. So that's item number one. And item number two, I think this really stifles onshore American innovation if we can't commit these research dollars and not have onerous tax treatment while we're still growing, potentially emerging technology.
First off, I could not agree with you enough on that statement about, founders and bootstrap founders too, not fully understanding the R&D benefits that are out there. Now, that being said, look, I think this is one of those things. This is the kind of optimization that doesn't matter unless you get some revenue. So I think part of the reason why a lot of early stage founders don't do anything with it is because, frankly, even if they raised money, they're just trying to survive for the first 12 or 18 months. And even though they might be able to claim that it's 100% R&D, the company's probably not going to survive long enough to benefit from it. But this is like one of those interesting things where it stands to affect everybody, but nobody really understands it. My cynical view on this, on the bootstrapped side, ironically, is that if this just clears out all of these shady middlemen that claim to help bootstrapped companies, extract their R&D value, it can't happen soon enough. But we can't lose the benefit either. I mean, I think, yeah. Anyway, this was one of those topics where when you first sent it over, I'm like, I don't know. This sounds like rich people problems. But the reality is I go back to my own email and I'm like, wait a second. Like for businesses like ours, this R&D benefit was really designed for, capital intensive things, like you're developing the next pharmaceutical or the next, car company or the next, aircraft. Things that take way more than a year. So you do need to be able to like invest heavily, amortize it, get the beneficial treatment of that.
It's like when we were in Fresno, pretty much every company in Fresno would have been taking advantage of this legislation or this tax code structure.
Right. Yeah, because like things in agriculture, things in that sort of industry it's not like, oh, I'll deploy 3 lines of code next week or tomorrow or in an hour. So I think this will be interesting to see how it plays out, because the ramifications of it are that people will just do this stuff elsewhere. They'll develop the next cancer drug in Canada or Brazil instead of doing it here.
I think businesses can find ways to perform in high tax environments. I think they can find ways to operate in low tax environments. I think they can find ways to operate in almost any environment if you just give them the rule book. And I think the issue here is twofold. One is this change was buried so deep in this tax bill that most of these companies probably didn't have advanced knowledge. And in fact, some of these companies probably weren't even around when this bill was passed. And so there wasn't adequate knowledge, nor was there an adequate way to find out about it. Sure, you could research all the potential future tax code changes, but that's a pretty massive concept when you're just getting involved in the business. Secondarily, when you think about that and you think about these changes, and again, I'm trying not to get into the political side of things here, but if you Google things like research and development tax credit issue, you find articles dating back over a year on this issue, and warning signs and quotes from Congress people and all this sort of stuff. But there has not been any legislation to amend this. I think it's fair to say, without sounding overly political, that our current political system is not functioning at a high level, and that a good number of people probably see the benefit in keeping research and development onshore in the U.S., fueling American jobs. And this would seem to be the sort of thing that could get agreement, but hasn't. And that just leads to this. As we sit here today, if you told me you're going to start if Paul is starting Newco today and you understand the rules, you can plan for it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think we know what's going to happen, because it sounds like there is some appetite to change this in the future. So, now your choices are: do you reserve capital because you assume you're going to have larger and larger tax bills over the next few years, or do you risk it and hope that the government passes legislation to save your ass?
Right.
Those are not fun choices when the capital you're reserving is measured in $500,000 and $1 million increments.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I like that statement you used earlier. I forget exactly how you said it just about 2 minutes ago, but you said something along the lines of capitalism sort of finds a way. and
high tax environment, low tax environment. If you hand us the rule book, we'll figure it out.
That's right. And I think, if there's plenty of rule books available around the world now too. So that's the thing, is that there could be some unintended side effects of rolling something as heavy-handed as this out. Venture capital firms are probably some of the best at figuring out how to route money through different countries to either utilize certain tax treaties or avoid others. And I think there's also there's public's history of this too. I mean, if you go read, the public statements from companies like Google and Apple and stuff like that. If I just ask the average listener of this podcast, hey, Apple has $500 billion of cash, where do you think it is? I think most people sort of imagine Scrooge McDuck way back in DuckTales, like there's a vault somewhere and they're swimming through it. But you go read the public statements that they're filing in their filings, and you can see that the dollars have been moved to other places. Could be Ireland.
That's the one I was saying. Yep.
The point is, there's a treasury's function.
Yeah.
There's a treasury's function for these businesses, which is totally legal, and they find creative ways to leverage the money into places that may give them the ability to use it better. That sort of thing. So,
who knew so many tech companies need to visit Ireland on an annual basis?
Or Mauritius, or Cyprus, or the British Virgin Islands, or I should probably stop. so, but anyway, I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how this plays out. I
agree.
I know we're running a little long here. One other thing I'll just say about this is that the timing of all this is also really interesting too. I know I didn't talk about this with you in the pre-show, but so, in the healthcare world, we had the Change healthcare systems go down back in February. Basically, whether they knew it or not, something like 1 in 4 Americans' data was affected by this.
Oof.
And it's kind of suggested that was a nation state actor that did that. It wasn't like some kid sitting in a basement in Eastern Europe. Since then, there's been multiple things. And just most recently, yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, Cisco, which is the hardware company that arguably, I think, powers almost all the edge network hardware for the internet, disclosed that there's at least 2 more breaches by nation states getting into their hardware. And so I just find this whole, we don't have to discuss it. I just think the timing of all this is interesting. We have more and more publicly documented scenarios where nation states seem to be involved here.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, we're having what seems to be slight loosening of IP protections and potentially this tax problem that might force innovation to move elsewhere. It's just interesting how it's all coalescing. 2024 is turning out to be a crazy year.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I would agree. I would definitely agree.
don't get me
with that.
started on data center fires in Ashburn, Virginia last week. That was not a good day.
We won't go there, but we will go to Stripe and crypto the next time that you and I record. And I will say that if you ever needed more concrete proof that you have school-aged kids, it's a Scrooge McDuck reference diving into a pot of gold.
So you probably, of all people, Disney, you know this, like Disney is like remaking all the movies, right? And so I guess there's like a trailer for a potentially new DuckTales or something. And so I was like, oh guys, you got to watch this. And I put on the original that I would watch in the 80s.
Oh, grainy picture and everything.
Henry, my oldest boy anyways, he's like 4. You remember how like the credits used to roll at the beginning?
Yeah.
So I turned this on and like for the next 2 minutes, he's arguing with me that I've turned it on at the end of the episode. And I'm like, no, Henry, this is how it used to be. You had to see all these names before you watched the show. And he's like, why do I want to watch that? You guys did it all backwards.
I mean, he's not wrong. Yeah, he's not wrong. The list of things that we did backwards is quite long.
I wish, what would be a good tourist attraction? This is probably a business idea for somebody listening to this. Somebody should create like it doesn't have to be a theme park, but just create like a Blockbuster. I just want to be able to walk my kid through that and be like, this is how you used to pick entertainment.
Yeah.
You'd have to like beg mom to take you there. And even if you did that successfully, you had to come back like a day later to return it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
They could probably charge me $35 per kid to walk my kid through there and tell them how good they have it now.
Back in my day, as Paul shakes his fist. And I could just see it, and I apologize, Alex. I could just see Alex coming up with more memes. Yeah, just based on that. So I think that's a great place to pin it. But we got to talk Stripe and crypto because we need another fight this week. We need another.
All right, let's leave it.
We need another fight. So.
All right. So you were in Vegas last week. Where are you heading this week?
I think I'm home. We got some family. We got some family stuff going on, some medical stuff. So I think I'm gonna be around.
Whoa.
How about you?
Nowhere this week.
You should get out more. You know why? Because airfare is wickedly expensive and the product on board has degraded significantly. So you really want to be a part of paying more for less, please.
I guess. Well, I'm going to be assembling a grill after hours this week, and we'll see. I'm going to try to smoke some meats. We'll see.
What a great place to leave it.
I love it. All right, man. I'll talk to you soon.
All right.